For a moment, imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning, check the news on your phone, and see the headline everyone feared. The United States and Iran are now in open conflict. At first, it feels distant, like another geopolitical crisis happening somewhere far away. But then something strange starts happening. Gas prices jump overnight. Stock markets start shaking. Politicians in Ottawa suddenly hold emergency meetings. And within weeks, the ripple effects start showing up in places you would never expect. Your grocery bill climbs, energy costs spike, news outlets begin warning about security threats and global instability. This is the reality many experts are quietly talking about. A full-scale conflict between the United States and Iran would not stay contained in the Middle East. The shockwaves could travel across the global economy faster than most people imagine, and Canada could feel those effects almost immediately. Today on the Maple Doctrine, we are breaking down 7 ways a US-Iran war could hit Canada harder and faster than most Canadians realize. But before we go deeper into this story, take 2 seconds to support the channel. If you enjoy clear explanations about global politics and how major world events actually affect everyday life in North America, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the Maple Doctrine. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these deep dive discussions coming. Now let's start with the first shock Canadians would probably feel within days: energy prices. Whenever conflict erupts in the Middle East, global oil markets react instantly, and Iran sits right next to one of the most important energy choke points on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow stretch of water every day. If military tension disrupts that route, even temporarily, global oil prices can skyrocket. That doesn't just affect the United States. Canada's economy is deeply tied to global energy markets. Within days, drivers across Canadian cities could see gas prices climbing higher and higher. Transportation costs rise. Airlines raise ticket prices. Shipping becomes more expensive. And suddenly, a war across the ocean is quietly draining money from Canadian wallets. But rising fuel prices would only be the beginning. The second impact could slowly creep into something everyone depends on: food. Modern agriculture runs on energy. Farmers rely on fuel, fertilizer, and transportation networks that connect global supply chains. When oil prices surge and international trade routes become unstable, food production becomes more expensive. Groceries that already feel expensive today could start climbing even higher. Bread, meat, vegetables, dairy, everything tied to transportation costs becomes vulnerable. And in a country as large as Canada, where food often travels thousands of miles before reaching grocery stores, those increases can add up quickly. The third effect would likely show up in financial markets. War creates uncertainty, and uncertainty makes investors nervous. Stock markets often react quickly to geopolitical crises, because businesses don't know how long the conflict will last, or how severe the economic disruption might become. Canada's financial system is closely connected to the United States, and if American markets experience turbulence, Canadian markets usually follow. Retirement funds, investments, and even job stability in certain industries can suddenly feel less secure. It doesn't mean a financial collapse is guaranteed, but volatility alone can shake economic confidence. Now things begin to move into more serious territory. The fourth impact would likely appear in politics. Canada and the United States are not just neighbors. They are military allies through NATO and multiple defense agreements. If Washington becomes deeply involved in a conflict with Iran, diplomatic pressure on allied nations often increases. That means Canadian leaders could face tough decisions about how much support to provide, whether through intelligence cooperation, logistics, or other strategic assistance. Suddenly, debates about a war thousands of miles away become heated political conversations inside Canada itself. The fifth effect would involve security concerns. During international conflicts, cyber warfare and intelligence operations often intensify. Countries involved in a conflict sometimes target allies of their opponents through cyber attacks or digital influence campaigns. Canada, as one of the United States' closest partners, could become a target for cyber disruptions aimed at government networks, infrastructure systems, or financial institutions. These kinds of operations rarely make dramatic headlines, but they can quietly create serious risks behind the scenes. The sixth impact involves something many Canadians may not immediately think about: migration pressures. Major conflicts in the Middle East historically lead to humanitarian crises and displacement. Canada has often played a role in accepting refugees during global emergencies. If instability spreads across the region, Canada could once again face complex decisions about humanitarian response, immigration policy, and the resources needed to support displaced populations seeking safety. And finally, the seventh impact may be less visible but just as powerful: global uncertainty. When major powers move toward open conflict, businesses hesitate, governments tighten strategies, and people start questioning the stability of the world around them. Even if Canada is physically far from the battlefield, the psychological and economic effects of global instability can ripple through every major economy. The truth is, Canada and the United States are deeply interconnected. When America experiences a major geopolitical shock, Canada almost always feels the ripple effects sooner or later. And in today's globalized world, those effects travel faster than ever before. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Some analysts believe Canada could actually face unique risks that other countries might not experience in the same way if tensions between the US and Iran escalate further. And in the next part of this video, we are going to explore those hidden vulnerabilities and why some experts believe the consequences for Canada could arrive much sooner than most people expect. Now here's where the situation becomes even more complicated. When people think about a potential conflict between the United States and Iran, most assume the consequences will be limited to the Middle East and maybe parts of Europe. But Canada sits in a very unique position. It is not only America's closest ally geographically, but also one of its most deeply integrated economic and security partners. That means when Washington faces pressure during a global crisis, Canada often feels the impact almost instantly. And some of those impacts can appear in ways that most people never expect. One of the first hidden pressures could appear inside Canada's defense and intelligence systems. During times of global conflict, allied nations often increase cooperation behind the scenes. Intelligence sharing becomes more intense, military readiness increases, and governments quietly prepare for worst-case scenarios. Canada is part of the Five Eyes intelligence alliance along with the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. This network shares sensitive security information constantly. If tensions between the US and Iran escalate into open confrontation, Canadian intelligence agencies could suddenly find themselves much more involved in monitoring threats, tracking cyber activity, and strengthening national security defenses. But the pressure would not stop there. The next challenge could emerge in Canada's economy through global trade disruption. Many people forget that modern economies depend on stable international shipping routes. If conflict spreads around the Persian Gulf, one of the world's busiest energy corridors could face disruptions. Even small interruptions in shipping traffic can create panic in global markets. Insurance costs for cargo ships increase, trade slows down, and supply chains become unpredictable. Canada exports billions of dollars in goods every year, from natural resources to agricultural products. When global shipping becomes unstable, those exports can slow down, and businesses across Canada may start feeling the pressure. Another issue experts often warn about is inflation. Inflation isn't always caused by domestic problems. Sometimes it arrives from outside forces that push global prices upward. If a US-Iran conflict drives energy costs higher, transportation costs follow. When transportation becomes more expensive, almost every product becomes more expensive to move. Companies pass those costs to consumers, and suddenly the price of everyday goods begins creeping upward. For Canadian families already dealing with rising living costs, even a small wave of inflation triggered by global conflict could make life noticeably harder. There's also the possibility of pressure on Canada's military commitments. Canada has historically supported international coalitions during major conflicts, though the level of involvement varies from situation to situation. If the United States calls for support from allies during a major confrontation with Iran, Canadian leaders could face serious political debate at home. Some Canadians would support standing firmly with the United States, while others would argue for avoiding deeper involvement in another overseas conflict. That debate alone could dominate political discussions across the country, but perhaps the most underestimated factor is cybersecurity. Modern conflicts are not fought only with missiles and troops. Many battles now happen in digital space. Cyber attacks can target power grids, government databases, financial networks, and communication systems. Canada's advanced infrastructure makes it a highly connected country, which also means it can be vulnerable to digital threats. If Iran or groups aligned with it decide to target Western allies through cyber operations, Canada could become part of that digital battlefield, whether it wants to or not. At the same time, global instability tends to push investors towards safer assets. This often strengthens the US dollar while putting pressure on other currencies. When the US dollar rises sharply, it can create challenges for other economies that trade heavily with the United States. Canada's currency and financial markets often move in response to American economic shifts. A major geopolitical crisis involving the US could create unpredictable movements in the Canadian dollar, affecting trade and investment decisions across multiple industries. And then there's the psychological impact. During times of international conflict, uncertainty spreads quickly through society. Businesses delay expansion plans, investors become cautious, and governments focus more on security than economic growth. This atmosphere can slow economic momentum even if a country is not directly involved in the fighting. Canada's economy, which relies heavily on trade and international cooperation, is particularly sensitive to global instability. The most important thing to understand is that Canada's connection to the United States is both its strength and its vulnerability. That partnership brings enormous economic and security benefits during stable times, But during periods of global tension, it also means Canada can be pulled into the ripple effects of American geopolitical conflicts faster than many people expect. And this brings us to the most surprising part of the story. Some analysts believe that if a US-Iran conflict escalates dramatically, Canada could face consequences that go far beyond economic disruption or political debate. In fact, there are scenarios experts quietly discuss that could affect North America as security environment in ways that very few people are currently paying attention to. In the final part of this video, we're going to look at those possibilities, explore what experts believe the long-term consequences could be, and explain why some analysts think Canada needs to start preparing now for risks that may appear much sooner than expected. Now, let's talk about the possibility that most people rarely consider, but security analysts quietly discuss behind closed doors. When global tensions rise between powerful nations, the risks don't always stay limited to the battlefield. Sometimes, the consequences travel across oceans, through alliances, and even into the daily lives of countries that are thousands of miles away. And because Canada shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, any serious escalation between the US and Iran automatically places Canada inside a much larger strategic picture. One concern experts sometimes raise is the idea of indirect retaliation. In modern conflicts, countries don't always respond directly against the strongest opponent. Instead, they may target allies, economic systems, or softer points of pressure. Canada, as one of America's closest partners, could become part of that broader equation. That doesn't mean missiles flying toward Canadian cities, but it could mean increased cyber pressure, influence campaigns online, or attempts to disrupt infrastructure in subtle ways that create instability. Think about how dependent modern life is on digital systems. Power grids, banking networks, transportation systems, communication platforms, almost everything relies on connected technology. Cyber experts have warned for years that global conflicts could trigger waves of digital attacks across multiple countries. If tensions between Washington and Tehran were to explode into a full confrontation, Canada could see increased cyber probing against government networks, financial institutions, and energy infrastructure. These kinds of attacks often happen quietly, but their effects can ripple through the economy and public confidence. Another long-term concern involves global alliances shifting under pressure. A major conflict can force countries around the world to take sides politically, economically, and diplomatically. Canada usually tries to balance strong support for its allies with a careful diplomatic approach. But if a major crisis unfolds, that balancing act becomes harder. Decisions made in Ottawa could affect trade relationships, international partnerships, and Canada's role on the global stage for years to come. Energy markets could also reshape Canada's position in the world. If oil supplies from the Middle East become unstable during a conflict, global demand for reliable energy sources could surge. Canada holds some of the largest energy reserves on the planet, which means international attention would quickly turn toward North America. On one hand, that could create economic opportunities. On the other hand, it could increase political pressure and geopolitical attention on Canadian resources, pipelines, and energy infrastructure. And then there's the broader economic shock that often follows major international conflict. When uncertainty spreads across the world, stock markets become volatile, supply chains tighten, and governments begin preparing emergency economic responses. Canada's economy is deeply connected to global trade. When the world economy slows down, Canada usually feels that slowdown quickly. That could affect jobs, investments, and the financial confidence of millions of Canadians. But perhaps the most important question is not whether Canada would feel the impact. The real question is how prepared the country is to handle sudden global disruption. History has shown that the world can change extremely fast when geopolitical tensions reach a boiling point. Events that once seemed distant suddenly become urgent national conversations. Governments shift priorities, policies change, and societies adapt to a new reality almost overnight. This is exactly why discussions like this matter. At the Maple Doctrine, the goal isn't to create fear or panic. The goal is to understand how global events can quietly shape Canada's future. Sometimes, the biggest consequences of international conflicts are not the ones we see on the news every day. They're the slower, less obvious ripple effects that gradually reshape economies, security strategies, and political decisions. And right now, the relationship between the United States and Iran remains one of the most unpredictable flashpoints in global politics. It might cool down, or it could suddenly escalate in ways that analysts cannot fully predict. But if tensions ever reach the point of open conflict, Canada will almost certainly feel the effects faster than many people expect. That's why it's important for Canadians to stay informed, ask questions, and understand how international politics connects to everyday life here at home. Because sometimes the events that begin thousands of miles away end up shaping the future of an entire continent. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Canada would stay mostly protected if a US-Iran conflict ever happened? Or do you believe the country would feel major consequences much sooner than people expect? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. Your perspective might add something important to this conversation. If you found this video insightful, make sure to share it with someone who follows global politics or cares about Canada's future. These discussions become much more valuable when more people join in. And of course, stay connected with the Maple Doctrine for more deep dives into the global events that could shape Canada. That's next chapter.